Hello, welcome to your online lecture for the course Anatomy and Physiology 2. This is the second lecture for the unit Endocrine System, and we're covering endocrine glands. You can see in this image all the various different endocrine glands that exist within our body. We won't be discussing the testes and the ovaries in this lecture because they'll be covered in the reproductive unit, and we also won't be covering the thymus. There are many other hormones too, considered minor hormones, that aren't really part of your traditional endocrine gland, and so we won't be covering them in this lecture. I also want you to keep in mind that the topic of endocrine glands is a lot more comprehensive than what we are going to be going through. But if you'd like to learn more, then you have the textbook as a good resource. We're going to begin with one of the most important and diverse endocrine glands within the body. It's located within the brain, and it's called the pituitary gland. If we focus in on this image, it is a cross-section through the brain. It's a sagittal section and a medial section. You can see here the thalamus. You can see underneath that the hypothalamus. Connected to the hypothalamus then is the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. The pituitary gland is two distinct glands, and they have therefore different ways of releasing their hormones. You can see a little bit more detail here in this zoomed in image at the bottom of the screen. The stalk that connects these two, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, is called the infundibulum, which is listed on your screen. And throughout this stalk, you'll see soon there's going to be the presence of both neurons and blood vessels. The two separate glands of the pituitary gland are called the adenohypophysis and which is also referred to as the anterior pituitary gland. And that is shown right here. Remember that anterior means more forward or towards the front. And then the other part of the pituitary gland is the neurohypophysis, which is also referred to as the posterior pituitary gland. So here's the posterior part here. I would also like to bring to your attention the hypothalamus again, which we'll speak about in much more detail later, but this is really the principal integrator within our body, integrating both the endocrine system and the autonomic nervous system, which you might remember from ANP1. This structure plays a very important role in coordination, making sure that the effects of the autonomic nervous system hormones and the endocrine system hormones are in sync and not conflicting with each other and trying to do opposite things, which would really end up creating chaos within the body. This diagram is from your textbook, and it overviews the 7 main hormones that are released from the pituitary gland. We'll begin by focusing on the adenohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary gland, and the 5 hormones that are released from this gland. So we have growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, and gonadotropic hormones, FSH and LH, as well as prolactin. And you do need to be aware of the full name rather than just the short form. So again, these are part of the anterior pituitary gland. So let's have a look at what these hormones do and what they're responsible for in our body. If we look into the anterior pituitary gland, if we looked inside, we would discover that there are 5 functional types of secretory cells present that are each responsible for secreting one of these 5 different hormones that you can see listed on the screen. They are both functionally and anatomically distinct, the cells that is. Cells that secrete growth hormone are referred to as somatotrophs. Growth hormone is sometimes referred to as somatotropin, as you'll see on an upcoming slide. Cells that secrete prolactin are called lactotrophs. Cells that secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone are called corticotrophs. Those that secrete thyroid stimulating hormone are called thyrotrophs, and those that secrete luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are called gonadotrophs because of their relationship to the gonads, as you will learn. You can see a commonality amongst many of these cells and their names with their releasing hormones. Next up, we're going to discuss both growth hormone and prolactin. That's why they're highlighted on this slide. And then after that, we'll continue with the rest of the hormones. As I've already mentioned, growth hormone is known as somatotropin hormone. Growth hormone, as the name suggests, is going to promote growth of many tissues, but primarily acts on bone and muscle. This hormone does many things as part of promoting this growth of bone and muscle, including accelerating the rate that cells are going to be able to take up amino acids, which are the building block of proteins, as you probably recall. And this is going to be very relevant for muscle growth. Growth hormone also helps stimulate the metabolism of fat. So that is the breakdown of fat. So if you have fat stored in adipose cells, which are fat cells or adipocytes, then growth hormone will basically mobilize those fats into the bloodstream, making them available for cellular breakdown. Because of this lipid mobilization, so this increase in lipid breakdown within cells, growth hormone is gradually shifting the body away from a normal glucose catabolism. Remember talking about glycolysis and using glucose as an energy source. And then remember the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So it's switching it from this glucose metabolism to a lipid metabolism. So using lipids as the energy source for cells to make energy, as opposed to glucose. Since glucose now is not being broken down in these situations, what we will end up seeing is an increase in blood glucose levels in this scenario, because the glucose within the blood is not being taken up by the cells to be used by energy. Instead, the fat is. So growth hormone actually acts as a bit of an antagonist to another hormone called insulin. Insulin, as you should know already, is a hormone that is released when blood glucose levels rise in order for glucose to be taken into the cell. In other words, insulin would try to reduce blood glucose levels, for instance, after you've had something to eat, whereas growth hormone actually ends up increasing glucose levels because it changes our body's fuel source to that of lipid metabolism rather than glucose breakdown, or lipid catabolism versus glucose catabolism. I had mentioned that we were first going to cover growth hormone, as we did, and now we're going to cover prolactin. So on to prolactin. Remember that it is also referred to as lactogenic hormone. Prolactin primarily plays a very important role when it comes to milk production in both pregnant and breastfeeding women. During the course of a woman's pregnancy, her prolactin levels will begin to increase, contributing to the increase in breast size and an increase in the ducts within the breast, the milk ducts. Prolactin will also start the process of triggering milk production shortly after birth as well. We'll come back to prolactin a little bit later to discuss its relationship to another hormone called oxytocin, which contributes to milk release rather than milk production. So if you'd like, you can put a note on this slide just indicating that there is a relationship with oxytocin. This here is a repeat slide, and I'm returning to this diagram from a few slides back just to show you that we've already discussed growth hormone and prolactin, and these hormones, it's important to note, are ones that have effects on their end tissue, meaning that growth hormone is primarily going to have an effect on its end tissue, which is bone and muscle, and then prolactin is its end tissue that it will have an effect on are the mammary glands. But with the other types of hormones that are boxed in red, these are considered to be tropic hormones that have effects on further endocrine glands. In other words, these hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland have the ability, as tropic hormones, to stimulate other endocrine glands rather than just their end tissue, as with the other two examples. With tropic hormones, the primary responsibility is to stimulate other endocrine glands, again, rather than an end tissue. This should be familiar to you from the first lecture covering endocrine regulation. For this slide, when we talk about these tropic hormones of the adenohypophysis, the actual tropic hormone itself will be listed then in orange, and the endocrine gland that they stimulate will be bolded in navy blue. The first hormone that we'll talk about is thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, and as the name suggests, it promotes the growth and development of the thyroid gland. We will cover the thyroid gland in more detail later on, so this is just an introduction. TSH also triggers the thyroid gland then to secrete its hormones. ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, promotes the growth and development of the adrenal gland. So remember that is the gland that sits on top of the kidney, and it primarily stimulates the cortex, or the outer region of the adrenal gland. It will also then trigger the cortex of the adrenal gland to then stimulate the release and secretion of some of its hormones. The next type of tropic hormones are categorized under gonadotropic hormones, or gonadotropins, relating to the gonads. So in other words, referring to the ovaries or the testes. And these hormones are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. As I mentioned earlier, you do need to know the full name, but you also need to know the abbreviation. Follicle-stimulating hormone. This has slightly different effects in males versus females, and that might be obvious since males and females have different gonads. When acting on the ovaries, it stimulates the growth of follicles, and then the follicles will start secreting estrogen as well. So what this will do is stimulate further production of estrogen. Now in males, it stimulates the production of sperm through the process of spermatogenesis. And it will also stimulate the secretion of a hormone called inhibin, which is involved in the negative feedback mechanism within the testes to control the production of sperm. We will elaborate on this later on in the course. The last gonadotropin hormone is luteinizing hormone, which in females stimulates the formation of the corpus luteum. And this will then produce and secrete progesterone and estrogen from the ovaries. Just to give you a very basic elaboration on what the corpus luteum is, after the ovary releases an egg through the process of ovulation, the corpus luteum remains, and it in itself is involved in producing hormones if the female remains pregnant. Otherwise, it will degrade. And you'll learn all about that in the reproductive unit. In males, it's going to stimulate what are called interstitial cells that are found within the testes to develop and secrete testosterone. It's important for you to know that the hormones we just spoke about that are part of the anterior pituitary gland, their release, or the control of their release, is by hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. And that, of course, is a very important gland that we spoke about as being a key integrator of the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. Neurons that are found within the hypothalamus can actually produce hormones. These are very specialized cells called neurosecretory cells, and there are different types of releasing hormones that are produced by the different types of neurosecretory cells found within this gland. The cells that produce hormones here are producing and releasing what are called releasing hormones that will end up stimulating the anterior pituitary gland. So you could almost argue that the hormones that are released from here, the hypothalamus, that end up stimulating the anterior pituitary gland are in themselves a type of tropic hormone, one gland stimulating another gland. So when the neurosecretory cells produce their hormone, they'll be released into the blood. So they're in these neurons. They end up being released into the blood through this portal system that's called the hypophyseal portal system, where they can then travel to the pituitary gland. These releasing hormones, once they arrive at the pituitary gland, they will target specific cells that they are designed for. This will then cause the cells found within the pituitary gland to then release their hormones, which we just spoke about on the previous slides, which will travel out of the pituitary gland through the anterior, because of its location, hypophyseal, referring to the pituitary gland, vein, and into the general circulation. The hypothalamus will produce specific releasing hormones, as mentioned, that are designed for specific cells of the pituitary gland. So think back to the lecture on endocrine gland regulation, that there are specific hormones produced by specific cells within a structure that will look for their target cell, in this case found within the anterior pituitary gland, and it will be able to bind to it like a lock and key. Let us now look at some different examples and put some of this together. At the top, you can see a variety of different releasing hormones, and we know that these releasing hormones are going to be produced by the hypothalamus. Specific cells within the hypothalamus then are producing their own releasing hormone. The hormones will then enter through the hypophyseal portal system, or the blood, towards the anterior pituitary gland. So going back here, we're saying they're released here and they travel through this structure here in order to release the gland. And once they reach their target gland or target cells, then the target cell will produce and release specific hormones which will enter into the blood circulation. Some of these hormones, though, will not further stimulate another gland, but others, for which we already discussed, will. And you can see those tropic hormones here. So we have the gonads that end up being stimulated again, the thyroid gland that's stimulated again. And when I say again, I mean another gland is being stimulated in the adrenal cortex. I'd like to point out the positives and negatives that you can see. And what that's referring to is that the releasing hormone is either going to have a enhancing or an inhibiting effect on the release of a particular hormone. And you can see that somatostatin is an example of a hormone that has an inhibitory effect on both growth hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone. So how does the body know then that enough of a hormone has been produced? How do we control the quantity that's in our blood and stimulating other glands? Well, the answer is in negative feedback loops, which most hormones are under the influence of. Remember, we have positive and negative feedback. Positive is going to accelerate and encourage more of the event that's happening, whereas negative is going to keep things under control. And so most systems are, and most hormones are under a negative feedback loop. So let's look at an example here. TRH stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone. So that would be released from, it's a releasing hormone released by the hypothalamus. And then we have thyroid stimulating hormone. And thyroid hormones, you'll learn about these soon, include T3 and T4. So here we have thyrotropin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus that signals the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland, which will stimulate the thyroid gland to produce its hormones, T3 and T4, which are released into the blood. Further secretion of T3 and T4 then is going to be regulated by a number of different feedback loops, in particular, long and short feedback loops. And what this does is help really fine-tune the effects of these hormones so that we have control over the amount that's released. So if we look here at both long and short loops, a long negative feedback loop allows the central nervous system to really have an input or an influence on the secretion of thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. But these shorter loops, T3 and T4, can end up returning back to the hypothalamus and telling the hypothalamus, okay, there's enough of us in the blood. You can stop your secretion of thyroid releasing hormone, which in turn will reduce the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, helping fine-tune the entire process. Before moving on to the posterior pituitary gland and its associated hormones, I want to show you a graph here that shows the secretion of growth hormone. In this example, the amount of growth hormone found in the blood plasma was plotted on a graph every 5 minutes over the course of 24 hours. And you should note that growth hormone fluctuates quite chaotically minute by minute, with these occasional peaks that get larger after falling asleep. The surges of growth hormone result in part from these pulses of growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which in turn will then stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to produce or release more growth hormone. The purpose of this slide is really meant to show you that it's not a nice smooth line when it comes to the presence of hormones in our blood. It's going to fluctuate all throughout the day and have these peaks and pulses that are going to change. This increase at night is part of the repair and restoration function of sleep. Now let's change our focus from the anterior pituitary gland to the posterior pituitary gland, which is also referred to as the neurohypophysis. So we talked a lot about this larger gland here, the adenohypophysis, and now we're moving on to the posterior component, or the posterior lobe. A key difference between anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary gland is that the posterior pituitary gland does not directly produce its own hormones. There are therefore no cells that are very discrete to the posterior pituitary that actually produce hormones. Now let's have a look here at the neurosecretory cells within the hypothalamus that are related to the posterior pituitary gland. You can see that they have a direct neuronal connection to the neurohypophysis, as opposed to connecting to the portal system through here to deliver the releasing hormones to the anterior pituitary gland. So this is much of a neuronal connection right down to the neurohypophysis. So let me reword this to say that the neurosecretory cells have their cell body located within the hypothalamus, and the axons, instead of stopping here, project all the way down into the posterior pituitary gland. Therefore, hormones that are synthesized in the hypothalamus are actually released directly into the posterior pituitary gland, where they'll be stored there and released there. So this differentiates itself from the anterior pituitary gland that, as I just mentioned, receives its hormones from the hypothalamus through that hypophyseal portal system or through the blood. So we'd have a blood connection here to the anterior pituitary gland, whereas we have a neuronal connection or axonal connection to the posterior pituitary gland. We know that there are 5 main hormones released from the anterior pituitary gland, but there's only 2 main hormones released by the posterior pituitary gland. But of course, we know that they're only stored and released here. They're produced by the hypothalamus. These 2 hormones are called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, also sometimes referred to as vasopressin, and oxytocin. It is the supraoptic nucleus that produces antidiuretic hormone and the paraventricular nucleus that produces oxytocin. Now, what is it that these 2 hormones actually do? Antidiuretic hormone, as the name would suggest, is basically against diuresis. And diuresis involves the production of a lot of dilute or large volumes of urine. Therefore, ADH, as the name anti would suggest, is countering that mechanism. For example, if you were very dehydrated, you would not want to be producing a lot of urine because that would further dehydrate your body. If you are dehydrated, then your body would end up releasing ADH, which would help your body reabsorb water in the kidneys, so really take back water in order to rehydrate your body. It allows your body to conserve water. And that concept will make a lot more sense once you learn about the urinary system. This hormone is also referred to as vasopressin because of its effect on blood pressure. And the release of this hormone can be triggered by your blood pressure, and that will come up in the cardiovascular system unit. But the short of it is that our blood volume is made up of all of our different cells as well as plasma, and plasma is primarily water. So if your body is dehydrated and there's less volume within your blood vessels, that reduces blood pressure. And if you're overhydrated and there's excess water within your blood vessels, then that can increase your blood volume, which is then increasing your blood pressure. And so because of that relationship with water in your blood vessels and the relationship with blood pressure, vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone is also involved. But that will come up again later. I mentioned to you already that oxytocin has a relationship with prolactin, and I'd said that prolactin is involved in the production of milk in breastfeeding mothers, but oxytocin is the hormone that actually triggers the release of the milk from the breast. When an infant begins to breastfeed, this action quickly causes the release of oxytocin, which works very fast to then allow for the release of milk. There are other effects that oxytocin has as well. It's involved in sexual arousal and social bonding, commonly referred to as the love hormone. In fact, groups of people can actually bond because of the presence of this hormone. So there's a lot of research being done around this hormone because it has a variety of different roles. Finally, of important note is that oxytocin is involved in childbirth as it causes contractions of the muscles of the uterus in order to induce childbirth. Women that are maybe have started their labor, or maybe they're late to start their labor and they end up being induced at the hospital, what their doctors can do is give them a synthetic version of oxytocin that's called Pitocin that will have a very similar effect. But that's a synthetic hormone, or not a naturally produced hormone. So we can say then, to finalize this slide, that the release of ADH and oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland is really controlled by the nervous system, because it is the hypothalamus that produces these hormones, and they travel along the axons to reach the place that they'll be stored, which is the posterior pituitary gland. Let's move on now and talk about the pineal gland. And it's located centrally within the brain, and it gets its name because it has a bit of a pine cone shape to it, not really quite as evident in this slide. It's considered to be part of the nervous system because it contains neurons that are responsive to visual stimuli that are directly connected from or to the retina, but it's also part of the endocrine system because it secretes hormones. The primary hormone that is secreted is melatonin, which is a key part of the body's biological clock. This hormone fluctuates daily. In the leading time upwards or up towards bed, your melatonin levels will begin to increase, and then they stay high throughout the night. A lot of this is based on the information that your eyes are getting by the darkness outside, maybe the darkness in your home, and it's critical for inducing sleep. I'll move on now to talking about the thyroid gland that's been brought up numerous times already. The thyroid gland is located on the surface of the trachea. The trachea is your breathing tube, and if you feel the front of your neck, you might be able to feel these ridges, and the ridges are cartilaginous rings of your trachea. So it's located at the anterior surface of the trachea, and it is found beneath the larynx, which is your voice box. You can see it takes on a butterfly-like appearance with its two lobes or lateral lobes, a connecting isthmus, and this projection at the top called the pyramidal lobe. You can also see, looking at this cadaver image here, albeit a lot less clear, but this would be the thyroid here. In total, it only weighs about 30 grams in an adult, but it has a major influence on our body's function. If we did a cross-section through the thyroid gland, you would see a very characteristic structure microscopically. You can see these small hollow spheres that are surrounded by follicular cells all around it. Now this here would be considered one thyroid follicle. Here's another thyroid follicle. You can see that it has an interior component that's referred to as the lumen, or the opening, and around it those follicular cells, as I just mentioned. And then there's blood vessels or capillaries found throughout, for which the hormones produced by the cells will be released directly into the surrounding capillaries. There are two different types of thyroid hormones. We have T3 and T4 for short. To explain how you pronounce this, so we have tri meaning 3 and tetra meaning 4. So tri-iodothyronine and tetra-iodothyronine. To break down the names, though, in more detail, both are thyronines, which are amino acids. So this is the amino acid component. And they either have 3 or 4 iodine molecules attached to it, so tri and tetra. These two hormones are released together, but T4 is the most abundant. But most of T4 that's released into the bloodstream will will get converted into T3 because one of the iodine molecules that makes it T4 ends up getting broken off. So it is important then for you to make note that T3 is the main thyroid hormone that has actions on cells, and it is much more potent. We will now go into further detail on how it is that the thyroid hormones are synthesized, and I'll be speaking for a little while on this slide, so you definitely want to pay extra attention to what I'm saying. We know that iodine is a critical component to thyroid hormones because we just spoke about that. And without a dietary source of iodine, it's impossible to make these hormones. Most salt that you consume nowadays has iodine added to it to avoid any potential deficiencies, and a lot of foods are fortified with it as well. Any iodine within our blood gets taken into the thyroid gland. At the bottom of the slide, or this image, you can see that this is the actual lumen of the thyroid follicle, and this area here is at the level of the follicular cells, and of course the blood vessel. And you can see in the blood vessel that iodine or iodide ions and various amino acids are going to be taken up into the follicular cells, and then so they're taken up into the follicle, and eventually you can see the synthesis occurring and the formation of thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is a chain of amino acids that has both tyrosine and iodine added to it. If we look closely, you can see these purple molecules that we said represents the iodide ions. And these purple units are going to be attaching themselves to yellow structures. And these yellow structures are the tyrosine amino acids, which originated up here. And these are going to form this small little side chain to the main thyroglobulin molecule. This is considered the precursor to thyroid hormones, and it is going to be stored here. This is where storage is going to occur. But this is also where secretion will occur when our body needs to produce thyroid hormones. And you can see that when our body needs to, through the process of endocytosis or taking something into the cell, thyroglobulin will be brought into the follicular cell. Here, they're going to be broken down. Any of the amino acids forming the main chain can be recycled and reused. But what we're left with are tyrosines that are going to be attached to either 3 or 4 iodine molecules. T3 and T4 are considered lipophilic, which means that they need to have a transporter protein attached to them in order to get to their specific targets around the body, because remember, our blood or our plasma is primarily water, and so they need a carrier because we know that both fat and water do not mix very well. Once they're secreted out of the thyroid follicular cells and then into the bloodstream, they will bind to the plasma proteins, or those carrier proteins. These plasma proteins are called thyroid binding globulins, which you can see here, TBG. After binding to thyroid binding globulins, they will circulate throughout the body until they reach their target cells, at which point they will dissociate from the plasma protein carrier, or TBG, and they'll be taken up into that target cell. So what do these thyroid hormones actually do? Well, they have very diverse effects on many different cells within the body. In general, we can say that they help regulate metabolic rate of all cells. They increase metabolic rate of cells. They increase cell growth and cell differentiation. They pretty much act on all cells, and so thyroid hormones, they don't really have a specific target tissue like some of the other hormones in our body do, but you could say more of a general target tissue because of their ability to act on so many different cells. A couple of slides ago, you may have observed these small cells that lie outside of the follicles. These are called parafollicular cells. I'll show you here. Don't confuse this word parafollicular with a hormone that we'll be talking about soon called the parathyroid hormone. Para can mean beside or near, so they're located near follicular cells. It took a lot of research to learn that these cells secrete yet another hormone, which is called calcitonin. Calcitonin is produced by the thyroid gland, but by the time it was discovered, the thyroid gland was very much only associated with T3 and T4. The name it was given was calcitonin, which reflects its purpose, which is to maintain calcium homeostasis within the body. If calcium levels are high in your blood, then calcitonin will work to decrease these levels by promoting removal of calcium from the blood. And when calcium is removed from the blood, our body will deposit it into bone, which really promotes conservation of the hard, bony matrix that is our bone. There's also a hormone that exists that is an antagonist to calcitonin. In other words, it works in opposition, and this is called parathyroid hormone. This hormone, as I said, causes the opposite effect. So if calcium levels then were low in the blood, parathyroid hormone would work to pull calcium out of your bones and put it into your blood. If calcium levels are high, then calcitonin would work to take calcium out of your blood and deposit it into your bone. And so that's how they work in opposition. And these hormones then work on a negative feedback loop as well. On the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, you can see 4 distinct regions called the parathyroid gland. They weigh very little, only about 1 gram. The parathyroid glands produce the hormone just mentioned on the previous slide, parathyroid hormone. This diagram demonstrates the negative feedback mechanism that I already discussed on the previous slide. We are now moving on to another main endocrine gland called the adrenal glands, and these glands sit on top of the kidney. So if we have 2 kidneys, then we have 2 adrenal glands. When we cut through the adrenal gland, we can see that there are 3 distinct layers. There's this outermost part or layer that's called the capsule, and this is really the protective connective tissue layer. The next layer in is called the cortex. You can see it shown here. So this region all here is the cortex. And then we have and this is the layer where the hormones are produced. And then we have the most inner layer called the medulla. Now, if we take a cross section of mainly the cortex, we can see that there are 3 additional layers, which you can see listed here, from most outer to most inner. And then there's another image to show you here. The most outer layer of the cortex is called the zona glomerulosa. Then we have the zona fasciculata and the zona reticularis. These different regions are actually responsible for secreting different hormones, and you can see within the diagram which hormones are released from which layer. So the most outer layer here, the glomerulosa, produces mineralocorticoids. Then that inner layer here, the fasciculata, glucocorticoids, and the reticularis produces gonatocorticoids. All have that suffix being corticoids. And then the medulla, that most inner layer here, produces catecholamines. Let's elaborate now on the hormone released from the zona glomerulosa, which is a mineralocorticoid. And remember, that's that most outer layer of the cortex of the adrenal gland. The primary mineralocorticoid that we'll focus on is called aldosterone, and the primary role of aldosterone in our body is to maintain levels of sodium within our body. In other words, aldosterone is involved in sodium homeostasis. When aldosterone is produced, it is going to trigger an increase in sodium reabsorption within the kidney tubules. This concept will make a lot more sense once we get to the urinary system and we go into detail, but ultimately within our kidneys, we have all of these tubules that exist within here that are going to work to produce urine. Anything that ends up within the tubules at the very end of the tubule system will end up as part of our urine. If our body needs more sodium, aldosterone will stimulate these tubules to allow our body to take back or reabsorb sodium from the tubules and put it back into our body. If aldosterone wasn't stimulating the tubules to do this, then the sodium would just end up as part of our urine. Now, whenever sodium moves in one direction, water likes to follow according to osmosis. So when we reabsorb sodium because of the stimulation of aldosterone, water will follow from the tubules as well. And so what we end up with is more sodium and more water within our body. So we can say then that aldosterone can be released under situations of dehydration when our body has lost sodium and has lost water, let's say in circumstances such as sweating. But in this process, when our body is dehydrated, there are certain certain ions such as potassium and hydrogen that if they stay within our body, they can become toxic in this state of dehydration. So in addition to reabsorbing sodium and water, our body will get rid of hydrogen and potassium to avoid the potential toxicity. Aldosterone is under quite a complex cascade control system called the RAS system, which stands for renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. This is briefly summarized in this diagram. In situations where you have a decrease in sodium ion concentration, this will then trigger the production of renin from the kidneys. So we're showing right here, number 1, the release of renin when sodium levels are low in our body. Renin then is considered really the first hormone in this cascade system that we're going to be speaking about. Now in turn, renin will then act on an inactive hormone called angiotensinogen, okay, an inactive hormone. This is constantly a hormone that's constantly being produced by our liver. When renin is secreted, it will act on angiotensinogen, that inactive hormone, which will convert it into angiotensin 1. Then, angiotensin 1 gets converted into angiotensin 2 at the level of the lungs. But it can only convert to angiotensin 2 if it first comes into contact with angiotensin converting enzyme, also known as ACE. Angiotensin 2 will then circulate to the adrenal cortex on top of the kidney. Aldosterone will be released. That's where we know aldosterone comes from, so it'll be stimulated to be released. Aldosterone will enter into the circulation. It will end up acting on the kidneys, specifically on the tubules of the kidneys, in order for us to take back sodium, which we call sodium reabsorption, and then of course water follows by reabsorption. All of this increasing the amount of sodium ions in our blood. This is the cascade system that helps with sodium homeostasis. Next, from the zona fasciculata, we have glucocorticoids, namely cortisol, cortisone, and corticosterone. The primary glucocorticoid in terms of abundance, activity, and potency is cortisol. Cortisol is commonly referred to as the stress hormone, and we'll come back to this. Glucocorticoids are mobilizing proteins that can be used as an energy source, and therefore they're also said to be gluconeogenic. Gluconeogenic means producing new glucose or new sources of glucose. And this is primarily done from the catabolism of protein, but also carbohydrates and lipids. There are many different functions of glucocorticoids, but a big one in conjunction with epinephrine is the maintenance of normal levels of blood pressure on a regular basis all throughout the day. With cortisol being a stress hormone, and when I talk about stress, I mean, sure, mental, but mainly physical stress. When our body goes through physical stress, we get a substantial increase in cortisol into our blood. Similar to growth hormone, we get these peaks in cortisol secretion throughout the day. And so you can see in this graph that we get a surge when we first wake up and within the first few hours of waking, and then it drops off. Similar as well to growth hormone, glucocorticoids virtually act on all cells in the body. The interior of the adrenal gland, you'll recall, is the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla is composed of neurosecretory tissue, which is tissue that's composed, remember, of neurons that secrete their products into the blood rather than across a synapse. The medullary cells of the adrenal medulla will secrete their hormones during a sympathetic nervous system response. The hormones produced here will subsequently be released or secreted into the blood. The adrenal medulla secretes two important hormones, both which are non-steroid hormones. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and this is the majority of the secretion, as well as norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. These hormones will bind to receptors that are found on sympathetic effectors, such as the heart, such as smooth muscle throughout the body, and those are just examples. And they bind here in order to prolong and enhance the effects of a sympathetic stimulation by our autonomic nervous system. It should be familiar to you that the sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system, which also includes the parasympathetic nervous system. So to restate that, the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, is subsequently divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system is that system that's involved in fight or flight response, whereas your parasympathetic nervous system is involved in the opposite, which is rest and digest. And you can see here the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine by the adrenal medulla by neurons, or those neurosecretory cells, into the blood, for which they will then travel to a target organ. In this case, we said it's a sympathetic effector cell, for example, the heart, in order to prolong the effects. And it could be an increase in heart rate, for example, in a stressful response. Now we'll talk about the pancreas, which is this elongated gland that weighs up to 100 grams. If we look closer at the tissue that makes up the pancreas, you would note that it has both endocrine and exocrine tissue as part of it, which makes it a very unique gland. Exocrine glands. These are glands that produce a substance that is released via ducts directly and locally. So for example, the exocrine glands of the pancreas are going to produce digestive juices, which will be released and travel through ducts, where they will travel locally to the small intestine, where they will contribute to digestion. And that will make a lot more sense once we get to the digestive unit. But the endocrine portion, which is relevant for today's lecture, is made up of scattered tiny islands of cells, if we look closely, called pancreatic islets, or islets of Langerhans. And they account for only about 2 to 3% of the total mass of the pancreas, so not a whole lot in terms of what they weigh, but yet their role is huge. These hormone-producing islets that are found here are surrounded by cells called acini, and these are exocrine cells that secrete digestive enzymes into the small intestine, as just mentioned. On the next slide, we're going to talk about the different types of endocrine cells, or pancreatic islets, that exist, and you can see them listed here: delta, alpha, epsilon, beta, and PP, which stands for polypeptide cells. Here's a list of the 5 primary types of endocrine cells that are joined together by gap junctions, which joins them but also allows for communication. Alpha cells produce and secrete glucagon, which works to increase blood glucose levels by stimulating the conversion of glycogen to glucose in liver cells. What that means is that when your body is hungry, maybe you haven't had anything to eat, blood glucose levels need to remain stable. So glucagon, this hormone, will work to stimulate your liver to break down glucose that is stored there. It's stored in the form of glycogen, in order to put glucose into your blood so that it's available to be used as energy by cells in your body. Glucagon also stimulates the formation of new glucose by a process called gluconeogenesis, formation of new glucose. Beta cells produce and secrete insulin, which has the opposite or antagonistic effect to glucagon. Insulin tends to lower blood glucose by promoting the movement of glucose, as well as amino acids and fatty acids, out of the blood and into tissue cells. The glucose taken up by the tissue cells will then use it to produce energy in the form of ATP. So thinking back to glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. The delta cells produce and secrete somatostatin, whose primary role is to regulate other pancreatic endocrine cells. Somatostatin also inhibits the secretion of growth hormone, glucagon, insulin, and pancreatic polypeptide, which we will discuss next. Next up is pancreatic polypeptide cells, which produce and secrete pancreatic polypeptide, which, as I just mentioned, is going to be inhibited by somatostatin. Much is still needed to be learned about these cells, but what we do know is that they influence digestion by regulating digestive secretions from the pancreas and from the gastrointestinal tract. And this will all come up again in the digestive unit. Lastly, epsilon cells secrete ghrelin, which is involved in stimulating the hypothalamus to boost your appetite. So when your body wants you to eat something so that it can use the breakdown of what you eat for energy, ghrelin is a hormone that's going to stimulate your hypothalamus to encourage you to want to eat something. Ghrelin will also slow your metabolism down as well so that your body is more efficient with what's available for energy. And it also may play a role in obesity for probably fairly obvious reasons. Maybe people that are constantly being stimulated to eat may have issues with too much ghrelin through their body, stimulating their hypothalamus. But we're going to speak next about glucagon and insulin. This diagram outlines how blood glucose levels are going to be regulated within the body by hormones, glucagon and insulin. Let's start in a situation where you've just had something to eat. Your body has broken down what you've eaten into smaller substances that our body can absorb, such as glucose. The extra glucose that we've consumed will end up in our blood, which will increase the amount of glucose present in our blood, or raising our blood glucose levels. What this will do is cause insulin to be released from the pancreas. Insulin is going to encourage the uptake of glucose by cells in order to normalize our blood glucose. In addition, this higher level of blood glucose will also stimulate a slowdown in the glucose that is released by our liver, because we remember our liver stores glucose in the form of glycogen. But both effects are normalizing your blood glucose levels. Now let's look at a situation where you haven't eaten and your blood glucose levels are low. We still need a minimum amount of glucose within our blood for our body to function. And so what will happen is glucagon will be released, which will stimulate the liver to break down glycogen into glucose to increase your blood glucose levels. In addition, the amount of glucose that our cells take up will also reduce in order to keep some of that glucose within our blood. All trying to maintain homeostasis. Okay, on to a slightly different topic. The mucous lining of our gastrointestinal tract, very similar to the pancreas, contains cells that produce both exocrine and exocrine secretions. Gastrointestinal hormones such as gastrin, secretin, and cholecystokinin have an important regulatory role in coordinating the secretory and the motor activities that are involved in our digestive processes. Again, this will become much more important in the digestive unit. We've already spoken about ghrelin and its role in boosting appetite through stimulating the hypothalamus and in slowing metabolism. But this hormone is secreted as well by gastric mucosa, in addition to the pancreatic islets that we mentioned on one of our previous slides. Okay, finally, as far as a specific topic, we're going to talk briefly about the heart. The heart is another organ that has an endocrine role. This will absolutely come up when we get to the cardiovascular system unit. Although the heart's main function is probably pretty obvious, which is to pump blood, there's a specific area in the cell walls that contains cells that produce hormones. These cells produce several different peptide hormones, which are part of the non-steroid hormone group. The group of hormones is collectively called ANH, or atrial natriuretic hormone. As the name suggests, it is cells that are primarily found within the atria of the heart, which are two of the upper chambers of the heart. They produce ANH. Atrial cells increase their secretion of ANH in response to an increase in the stretch of the atrial wall caused by abnormally high blood volume or blood pressure. So let me explain that in a different way. If you have too much fluid within your blood vessels, that's going to increase volume compared to what it was, which is going to increase pressure. And so when this blood returns to the heart, if there's more blood returning the heart than is considered normal, it's going to stretch out the heart walls. When the heart walls stretch, these atrial cells are going to identify that there is too much volume within the heart's chambers. And so it releases a hormone called ANH in order to combat this. How do we combat this? Well, we ultimately have to get rid of water, since water is such a huge component of our blood. Now, the term natriuretic refers to the fact that its principal effect is to promote the loss of sodium from the body by means of the urine. When sodium is lost from our internal environment, we already know that water follows, again, due to the principles of osmosis. Water loss from the body in the form of urine results in a decrease in blood volume, and thus a decrease in blood pressure. We can therefore state that the primary effect of ANH is to oppose increases in blood volume or blood pressure. We can also state that ANH is an antagonist then to ADH and also to aldosterone. Because remember that ADH and aldosterone worked to increase the amount of fluid within our blood vessels by either reabsorbing more water or reabsorbing sodium and then water. But ANH is going to do the opposite, which is going to stimulate the release of sodium, and then of course water will follow. There are other endocrine glands that exist within our body aside from the ones that we've already spoken about today. And we can sort of state generally that many tissues in our body produce hormones, but it's really beyond the scope of the textbook and certainly the scope of this course to be covering all of those. That's all for today's lecture. Thanks for listening.